For many years, the Night King has been a mythical creature. He's been an idea based in fairy tales and religion. He was the enemy that represented winter, the harshness of what it can bring to Westeros, and it reminds people of the evil that can be overcome by man. But as time went on, the presence of winter became more prominent. And as winter came, so did whispers of White Walkers and the dead. And after a few encounters over the wall, those fairy tales of the Night King started to become real. The prophecies and the religion and the story of Azor Ahai started to become more real. The ancient texts about White Walkers suddenly became valuable and useful. And now we are in a position where the Night King isn't just a mythical character. He is an apocalypse that leaves no living behind. And now we're finally at the point where he's journeying south, and nobody knows who he is, what he wants, and what he's capable of. And in order to defeat such an unstoppable force as the Night King, you need more than a couple shards of dragon glass and dragon fire. Not only does his army constantly keep growing, he now has his own dragon. Because at this point, it seems almost impossible to defeat the Night King. How do you beat a season that's supposed to come? How do you beat someone that represents death? And how do you beat something that's a dragon rider? So first, I think in order to understand how to defeat something, you need to understand the character and what you're up against. The people who fight the Night King need to look past what he's doing now, and they need to look in the past and look at history to try and understand the Night King and what his motivations are. And that's why Sam Tarly, Melisandre, and Bran Stark play a pivotal role in The Long Night. They need to understand the Night King, based on text, based on religion, and based on history. And I believe that these characters could come to one of three conclusions. For one, the Night King could just represent death. As a character, he could be angry about being converted, or he could simply just be a weapon that wants to bring devastation on the world. Secondly, he could be his own character with his own motivation that we don't yet know. The Night King could have a target that he requires. That could be a child, a person, or a thing. Or the third option, the Night King is a character that belongs to the species of White Walkers, and he wants the good for his people. And to understand what motivation the Night King is after, we need to look at history. And we need to look at the Night King's actions to dictate what he wants. And I think the first thing we can look at is the actions that he's done, from the moment he attacked the first members of the Night's Watch, to the moment he took down the wall. And what we've seen so far is that there's an integrated culture, or a strategy that the Night King seems to be implementing. Right away we're introduced to White Walkers attacking members of the Night's Watch. But one thing we notice is one White Walker lets someone go. He throws a head to the Night's Watch member as a warning, almost like he wants him to journey south and tell them about the White Walkers.
I should have gone back to the wall and warned them, but I saw what I saw. I saw in White Walkers.
And based on this action, it makes sense that the Night King and the White Walkers want something. If they wanted pure devastation, they would have a surprise attack. They wouldn't send somebody south to Winterfell to warn them of their presence. So it seems to me they're warning the people of Westeros of something that they might have forgotten. And whatever that is coincides with the symbols that they're displaying. And the symbols that the White Walkers use harken back to a lot of different figures. The first obvious one is the Children of the Forest. The children have done countless symbols surrounding a weirwood tree, many of them in spirals. And these symbols have been mimicked from the Night King. This shows a higher form of intelligence, and it shows a culture that is formed in the White Walker species. But it also hints at a motivation of what the Night King might want. And not just the spiral, the Night King uses a lot of different symbols that represent the past and their current motivations. We see other variations of the spiral when Jon and Daenerys are looking in the cave. Some of them are more sporadic, others are more simple. But the reality is that they all have the foundation of birth. The birth of ice and fire. We see one symbol represented when Daenerys was born, with her 3 dragons. And we see the Night King himself wear a symbol, an arrow-looking pendant on his chest. And much like the spiral represents the Children of the Forest, I think the arrow on his chest represents the dragon glass that was plunged into his heart. And that dragon glass symbol that the Night King wears on his chest could be interpreted as this symbol that's displayed. So I think these symbols first of all represent the origins of the Night King and how he developed a culture for his new species. But it also serves as a warning. And he's leaving these symbols to be purposely found, because I'm sure they represent something. And these symbols, that culture, and this imagery even translates to when he converts babies. We see him take Craster's babies into the lands of always winter. And here the White Walker rests a baby in the center of ice pillars. These ice pillars are very reminiscent, if not exactly like, the stone pillars the Children of the Forest use. The Night King has copied similar rituals to birth people to his species or to his cause, which really shows the significance and the difference from the Night King resurrecting a baby and converting a baby into a White Walker versus resurrecting a person from the dead. Both are significantly different, and it shows that there's an underlying purpose through the symbols that the Night King leaves for people to find, and also the rituals that he practices. And if we apply this logic to the history and the stories of the Long Night, it changes the story. It changes our understanding of it. In the War for the Dawn, we were meant to believe that the Night King was pushed back by the Children of the Forest, the Andals, and Azor Ahai. And after he was pushed north, they built up an ice wall to keep the Night King from returning south. And what myth says is what pushed the Night King back was that Azor Ahai pulled a flaming sword, and he was able to fight him back. But do we really buy this? Does that make any sense? If you look at the Night King and the Night King's army, do you think that he could be fought off by one guy with a flaming sword? It doesn't make any sense. The Night King represents total death. The more people he kills, the more people he gets to his army. He's an unstoppable force. And after he was pushed south, and the wall was put up, why is he coming back now? Why didn't he come back before? Why didn't the Night King come back during a time where there were no dragons? There was no three-eyed raven. Because if he really wanted human extinction, and just death to cover all of the world, it would make a lot more sense if he came during a more vulnerable time. And then when you start to put the pieces together, it starts to make sense. The Night King represents more than just death, because he would have already brought it by now. And the Night King wants something more. That's why he's providing symbols, for people to look at, interpret, and understand. Because the truth is, you can't defeat the Night King. You only give the Night King what he wants. I doubt the Night King is coming south to fight off another guy or another woman who's gonna pull a flaming sword and push him back over the wall again. I bet the Night King waited thousands and thousands of years for the right moment, because now is time for him to come back south and get what was promised to him. And the Night King knows what was promised to him is there. The Night King shares many abilities that Greenseers do. You could argue that like Bran warging into people or animals and controlling them, the Night King can do the same thing with the dead. He's not just resurrecting them. Their eyes turn blue because he's warging in them. There's a reason why he can command the dead what to do, because he is warging into every single one. And that ability bleeds into the ability to Greensea. There's a reason why Bran, in his vision, saw the Night King staring at him. And there's a reason why the Night King was able to touch him and interact with him. It's because the Night King also exists in this universe. He can see history. He can see everything. And that's why he chose to come south now. Because whatever he's after, he knows it's there. And now that he knows that it's time, he's been communicating with the humans to try and get them to see. He warned members of the Night's Watch that he was coming. He leaves symbols for humans to interpret and understand. But I think we're in a position where so much time has passed, thousands and thousands of years, that there's a disconnect between the Night King and humans. They no longer understand each other. Or there's a lot of information that's been lost in lore and history. So now it's up to the living to understand what he wants, or there won't be anyone left. So the key to defeating the Night King is to give him what he wants. And to understand what he wants, you need to look at commonalities between now and the past. What happened in the War for the Dawn? And what is integrated in religion that we can look at to understand and interpret what the Night King wants? And you can find that through prophecy, religion, and old stories that have been written and told through generation to generation. And the first thing we can look at is the past. We know that the defeat of the Night King during the War for the Dawn doesn't really add up. And the story of the Night King's defeat was Azor Ahai. Azor Ahai spent countless days and nights preparing the ultimate weapon to defeat the Night King. He tempered his sword in water, and then he tempered his sword in a lion. But then he finally tempered his sword in his wife Nissa. She bore her breast, and he stabbed her and then pulled out Lightbringer. And that sword was born to defeat the Night King. But I think this story follows a typical religion trope. People want to look like the good guys and the heroes. And I think history was rewritten to capitalize on the victory of the humans and the defeat of the Night King. And over time, it became just a fairy tale story. What if instead of Azor Ahai tempering a sword and pulling a flaming sword called Lightbringer, what if it was a child? What if he found the right suitor, and Nissa was the right person to have a child with? And this child was Lightbringer, and it was the sacrifice that the Night King wanted to go back over the wall. And another word for that was the prince that was promised. It's not the savior, it's a sacrifice. It's the prince that was promised to the Night King. We know the Night King has a fascination with children with Targaryen descent. Craster's children have Targaryen blood. And we know in religion how important fire and ice are. Maybe that's why this is called a Song of Ice and Fire. It's about the peace between the two. The child of fire is a sacrifice that must be made to the Night King to keep peace. That's why the Night King leaves symbols. He knows that it is time to be given his debt. He knows it's time to claim the prince that was promised to him. And much like how religion is up for interpretation, I also believe that there's other signs of history that you can look at that hints at this interpretation. I believe that the Night King wanting a child of fire birthed the Targaryen lineage. I think there's a reason why the Targaryen symbol looks the way it does. Over time, it's transitioned into 3 dragon heads in the shape of a spiral. That's very reminiscent of the symbols that we see from the Children of the Forest and the Night King. Maybe it's a deep-rooted history that is integrated in the Targaryen sigil that hints at the purpose of being a fire-blood Targaryen, that eventually you will be taken and accompanied in the spiral of the Night King. And that would be your duty to preserve the living. And all of this information lines up with current prophecy that we've seen from our 2 main characters, Daenerys and Jon. Firstly, we have the Red God. We have Kinvara, who is from the Red Temple of Volantis, who believes that Daenerys is the one who can defeat and stop the Night King. But then there's Melisandre, and she chose Stannis as Azor Ahai, but if you look back at her prophecies, they all end up applying to Jon Snow and the prince that was promised figure. As she states, whoever is the savior or the prince who is promised is going to be king. They're going to betray the men serving them and their family. And that's the cost that's going to win the war. And the true war is to the north. And then another Red Priest, Thoros, says something interesting. Thoros Emir said, according to prophecy, our champion will be reborn to wake dragons from stone and reforge the great sword Lightbringer that defeated the darkness those thousands of years ago. If the old tales are true, a terrible weapon forged with a loving wife's heart, but great power requires great sacrifice. That much at least the Lord of Light is clear on. And much like Melisandre was putting her prophecies on Jon, Thoros is putting his prophecies potentially on Daenerys. Daenerys, known as the champion, will be reborn to awake the dragons from stone, which she's done. And she will be the one to reforge the great sword Lightbringer. And as we know in my interpretation, Lightbringer is not a sword, it's a child of Targaryen lineage. And as Thoros says, this terrible weapon is going to be forged with a loving wife's heart. And it makes sense this weapon is forged from love because it's forged from the most intimate act that you can do. This child is going to be created. And because this child is going to take great sacrifice, as Thoros says, great power requires great sacrifice. Sacrifice is in the prophecy. This child must be sacrificed to the Night King because it's the prince that was promised. And this can be interpreted in a couple of ways. The first interpretation I talk about in my video, The Myth of Azor Ahai, where Azor Ahai, who creates Lightbringer, is Rhaegar Targaryen. He forged Lightbringer in Lyanna Stark, and together they created Jon Snow, a product of ice and fire. And this feeds into Melisandre's visions, that Jon could potentially betray everything that he holds dear, and he will be king. And in this interpretation, if Jon Snow is actually the prince that was promised, then that means he might not just be the king of Westeros, he may be the Night King, the new Night King. And that would be one interpretation of the story. Or you could interpret the prophecy differently, and that interpretation comes from Thoros Emir. Jon is Azor Ahai, and Daenerys is Nissa. And I don't know if we'll see this in just 6 episodes, but together they could produce Lightbringer. They could have a child together, and there's been a lot of foreshadowing of that in the last season. And this child would be of great power, but he would need to be sacrificed to the Night King in order to end the long night. And that's what would fulfill Jon's role. The tragedy where Daenerys wants to hold on to her baby, and Jon will have to betray his family, his friends, and everything he held dear, including his own child, to make amends with the Night King. And that's in line with Jon Snow's character arc. Jon is always bringing peace between two sides. He is in the middle of ice and fire. He brought together the Wildlings and the Night's Watch. He tried to bring together Cersei and Daenerys. And now it's time for him to try and bring the White Walkers and the humans together. Because the only way to defeat the Night King is through peace. And the only way to achieve peace is to give the Night King what he wants. And that's the prince that was promised. And that could potentially be Jon and Daenerys' child.
This war of 5 kings means nothing. The true war lies to the north, my king. Death marches on the wall. Only you can stop him.
This war has just begun. It will last for years. Thousands will die at your command. You will betray the man serving you. You will betray your family. You will betray everything you once held dear. And it will all be worth it. Because you are the son of fire. You are the warrior of light. You will sweep aside this pretender and that one. You will be king.
What's my name? Jon Snow? And why is my surname Snow? Because you're a bastard from the north. I never met my mother. My father wouldn't even tell me her name. I don't know if she's living or dead. So I sat there in the brothel as Ros took off her clothes, but I couldn't do it. Because all I could think was, what if I got her pregnant? And she had a child. Another bastard named Snow.
You say you can't have children, but there are other ways of choosing a successor.
It's yours. It'd serve you well. And your children after you.
The dragons are my children. They're the only children I'll ever have. Do you understand?
And your family hasn't seen its end. You're still here.
I can't have children.
Who told you that?
The witch who murdered my husband.
Has it occurred to you she might not have been a reliable source of information?
And while I am confident that this interpretation is going to take one form or another in this season, we may be watching this part in Game of Thrones history for a reason. Maybe this is the time where they don't have to make peace. Maybe this is the time where Jon and Daenerys successfully defeat the Night King. And there's so many theories. The Night King could be Bran. Bran could have warged into the Night King. That would have given the Night King his green-seeing and warging ability. And maybe defeating the Night King would simply be killing Bran Stark. Or maybe history will repeat itself, and Daenerys or Jon will pull a flaming sword. But regardless of how Game of Thrones ends, I really think, based on interpretation and based on lore, that the Night King is coming south for a reason. And there are deep commonalities you can see between the 2 times he's come south. And the reality is that the Night King is more than just a killing machine. He's an individual that uses symbols, that implements strategy, that has a purpose in what he's doing. And there's a reason why Bran always goes back to visions of Jon Snow's bloodline. The fact that he's both ice and fire. There is a reason why Daenerys is the mother of dragons, and there's a reason why Jon and Daenerys are now together. I believe it's all a part of the Night King's plan, and they just have to figure that out before it's too late.